Are we? Yes. Okay. All right. We're starting a completely new play, starting with A Midsummer Night's Dream, and it's very much different from everything we have dealt with so far. When we looked at A Winter's Tale, we looked at a tragicomedy. It was one of those late plays like Cymbeline and The Tempest that have both elements of tragedy and comedy. In Winter's Tale, it had a happy ending, but plenty of death and sorrow in it. And the tragic element was positive in that there was indeed character growth on the part of Leontes. Almost all the characters grew. Julius Caesar was a dark play, extremely dark play. No humor in it anywhere. It was something of a tragedy, and it was something of a history. And we noted that there was a lot of overt philosophy in it, from the skeptics and the Stoics and such. Now with Midsummer Night's Dream, we're looking at an outright comedy. And as a comedy, it's pretty mature. It was toward the middle of Shakespeare's career that it was written, but it is pretty mature. And in it, there's almost nothing but positivity. The dramatic tension is even funny. But for something, it's very hard to write a comedy, because in order to make something all completely positive, it almost ends up always being trite. And so the nature of Midsummer Night's Dream is funny. The action is hilarious, and there's hardly a dark spot in it anywhere. It's a perfect summertime kind of play. If you look at some of the earlier comedies like Comedy of Errors or Two Gentlemen of Verona, they're a little bit immature and almost slapstick from time to time. This play has romance in it, but it doesn't swoon with romance, and everything holds together pretty well. This play has all kinds of everything in it, and some of the things are tangential, and I'm even going to go out on some tangents on some subjects that we've discussed in other kinds of talks. I'm at that point in life now that I'm realizing that a lot of subjects I'm not going to be able to come back to again. And so that whenever the opportunity comes up, I'm going to tie up as many loose ends as I can from previous topics and tasks that I've let lay for a long time. Some of these things come right at the beginning of the play. We'll have almost nothing from the play at all tonight. The play opens at the palace of Theseus, the king of Athens. Theseus is anticipating his wedding to Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, who is actually a war bride. At one time, Theseus and Heracles went and made war against the Amazons, probably just out of pride, knowing the two of them. And they won, and he brought home a war bride. Heracles was smarter. He just brought home the girdle, and that was enough for him. A number of interesting things in Greek mythology happened at the palace of Theseus. The palace at Athens was a mercy seat. Some say that this is where, in the Western world, all fair and merciful justice was born. It hinges on another story, the Agamemnon cycle. Before the war of Troy, Agamemnon was the king that led all of the other kings to war to win Helen back from Paris. But they waited for 12 years and they couldn't get winds to sail to Troy, which is really strange because usually the winds are prevailing westerlies, and I don't understand that. But anyway, they went to the oracle at Delphi, and the oracle sent back saying, "You will not get winds unless you sacrifice your daughter Iphigenia." And so Agamemnon sacrificed his own daughter. There are variants on the story. In one variant, he actually kills her on an altar made to Zeus, and in another version of it, he sends her off to a nunnery and sacrifices her to be a priest of Artemis, a virgin priest of Artemis. At any rate, they sail for Troy, and during the time that the Trojan War is going on, the wife of Agamemnon, who's called Clytemnestra, she takes up with a man called Aegisthus and has an affair with him, and she's just seething over the loss of her daughter. And she has a whole signal set up so that when the ships come back from Troy, that she knows immediately. And when Agamemnon comes back to his palace, he is murdered by his wife and by Aegisthus. The kids, Orestes and Electra, flee. And eventually, when he gets old enough, Orestes kills both his mother and her lover, and this is considered an unforgivable sin, and he's then followed around by the Erinyes, who are like furies that chase him and bother him, and nobody will take in a parricide, and he just he goes all over the place. He's being chased by these guilt embodiments until finally he comes to the palace of Theseus, and Theseus holds a trial and pleads mercy, and there is some kind of forgiveness, and he is cleansed of the sin of parricide. And so this was supposedly the beginning of justice in the Western world. So both the judicial system and the democratic system were born in Athens. Several years ago, we did those mythological talks on myths of triangles, and this is another one of those myths, only we talked at that time first about Oedipus, who married his mother and slew his father, and we talked about the trinity of that, and Oedipus was involved in Theseus also, because after he blinded himself when he discovered that he had killed his father and married his mother, he was in exile and nobody would take him in. And he wandered all over Greece until he came to a copse outside of Athens. And Theseus came and gave him mercy and said he could stay there forever and ever. If you ever get a chance to read it, read Oedipus at Colonus by Sophocles, because it's just filled with initiate mystery knowledge. It's much better than Oedipus Rex, and much more mature, and there are direct statements about seership and everything in it. So it's quite a beautiful play. But at any rate, he gets his mercy there too, and so two of the triangle myths are surround Theseus. In fact, we're going to see a third one in just a little bit. The name Theseus means he who lays down or he who deposits. And it isn't clear what the reference is, though some would say that it is justice and mercy that he lays down, and others would say that it is something else that he lays down, like his butt. We'll get to we'll get to that in a little bit. This is all stories tonight. I'm just going to mostly tell the stories and without going into much depth as far as meaning is concerned, but the stories are just so fascinating that they cover everything. He was born in Troezen, in that blob of a peninsula that had Sparta in it. And he was born to Aethera and Aegeus, though some say that Poseidon was his father. This is again one of those cases where a hero or a heroine, either one, is born to a fatherless family. The father is either a god or the father is invisible. This relates to this very same thing that we have in Christianity, where the Son, the Christ, or the second principle of Trinity represents the light, and the third represents the selfhood that is born from the Divine Mother, which is the light, and the invisible Father, which is the power that is never seen. And this is what is behind. We've talked about this, especially in the store. During the store hours, we talk a lot about children that are born to single-parent families, where they're raised by their mother. They're all being born with that same thing of seeking for an invisible father or for a father who wasn't there, and it's meant to awaken the seeking, questing kind of consciousness. But at any rate, Aegeus was visiting in Troezen. He had already had one wife called Melita, and I don't know if he had any children by her. But Medea, when she was fleeing after having slain her children, took refuge with Aegeus in Athens. And while there, she had a child that Aegeus fathered. And so she fits into the picture. And Aegeus was sort of out traveling around, and he was in Troezen, and he asked Medea to help him get a legitimate heir, not their son, but a legitimate heir. And while he's in Troezen, he is entranced and made drunk. And when he's drunk, he ends up in bed with Aethera. And supposedly this is how Theseus is conceived. However, as soon as Aegeus was finished with her, he fell asleep, and then Poseidon copulated with Aethera. And so that it's not known whether the Poseidon is the father, the divine father, or whether Aegeus is the father. But at any rate, they conceive the child, and he goes back to Athens, but before he does, under the stone altar to Zeus, he has some men lift up the stone altar, and he puts his sword underneath the stone altar, and he says, if we have conceived a son, when that son grows up, and if he can lift up the altar and pull the sword out of the stone altar, he will then be recognized as my heir, because I'll recognize my sword. And so Theseus grows up to be a very handsome, hulking young man, and his mother tells him the story of the sword, and he lifts up the stone and pulls the sword out of it, similar to the story in King Arthur. It is emblematic of the birth of selfhood in its fullest sense. The life spirit, the second principle of the Trinity, the life spirit is truth that is so pure and so dense, it is like a crystalline rock. And that when one becomes an initiate, the selfhood is taken out of the truth of that selfness, like pulling down a sunbeam right out of the pure light. This actually happens, like even with the visible, sensible sun. If you're with, or if you can see at a short distance away, somebody who is a very highly enlightened person, they literally have a sunbeam that comes right down from the sun to the individual, and that individual is surrounded by that. In fact, that is eventually how the earth will be leavened or raised up, is by everybody bringing down those sunbeams and dissolving the physical of it. As you can see, this is all chaos tonight, story upon story. So he takes his sword and he goes across the isthmus, the Narrows, and he goes to Athens to see his father. And along the way he has all sorts of adventures. He struggles with Periphetes, who is a man that has a brazen club that clubs people to death as they come down the path. And he does him in. I think the club in this case represents people who try to dominate others with will. He deals with Pitiocampus, who is called the pine bender, who is a very strong man who takes pine trees and bends them down. And he asks people to help him when they come along the path, and when they do, as soon as they've grabbed onto the pine tree, he lets go and it flings them out into the sea, and that's their demise. And he deals with a sow that likes to gorge people, and he works with a man who is called Skyron, who is a foot washer, or asks people to wash his feet, and as they wash his feet, he kicks them off the cliff into the ocean. All sorts of, he does them all in. And he finally deals with a man called Geryon, who is a crusher that wrestles with people, and he's so strong that he just pulls them in and he crushes them. And the final man he deals with is the most famous, is Procrustes. And Procrustes takes a measure of everyone. And he has, what he says, is the perfect sized bed. And everybody who comes along must lay in the bed. And if they're too short for the bed, he stretches them out, which means he pulls them apart. And if they're too long for the bed, he lops off the ends, which means the head and the feet. Yeah, and so that one who is said to judge everyone by his or her own standard is said to apply them to a Procrustean bed. These are all represent trials. They're very brief and they're very homespun. They're not nearly as rich as the trials of Heracles, the 12 labors of Heracles, which he goes through in the different stages of initiation to opening up the divine consciousness. These are more allegorical and much more simple-minded. When he gets to Athens, things are in quite a state, because Medea, who has had the son Midas by Aegeus, is jealous of him, and she would like her own son to become heir. And so what she does is she tries to poison him with wolf's bane. No, it doesn't work on dogs, Harry. And somehow at the last minute, both Theseus and his father recognize the cup as being a cup of poison, and Medea leaves and they chase her in vain pursuit. So Theseus is recognized as a hero and eventual heir to the throne of Athens. But he has to prove himself, and what has happened is, this is the famous story that everybody knows about, is Athens is having to pay a tribute of 20 young women, I think it's 20, it's either 20 or 50 young women every year to Minos, the king of Crete, because they were defeated in some kind of battle with the Cretians. And what happened is that it was either Minos or his predecessor had a daughter that got into bestiality. And he had this huge, big Grecian bull that she fell in love with. And so she had someone make the body of a cow that was hollow on the inside. And she crawled in there and united with the Grecian bull. And the result was a monstrosity. It was a human with a bull's head that liked to eat young women. Most interesting kind of consciousness. I believe he was told by the oracle that he couldn't kill it, that only a hero could kill it. So what happened is he had Daedalus build this maze, and he kept it penned up inside of the maze. And then every year, the Athenians would send this shipload of young women, and one at a time, the women would be fed to the Minotaur in the center of the maze. So what Theseus did is he disguises himself and a bunch of brave Athenians as women. And they sail off to Crete. And when they get there, he shows himself to the king's daughter, who was named Ariadne. And she falls in love with him. And she has this ball of string, which they tie in the lintel at the beginning of the maze, of the labyrinth, and it unrolls itself until it gets right into the center of the labyrinth. And all he has to do is follow it in and then wind it up on the way out. And so he goes in and he slays the Minotaur, meaning to say that the days of having to pay tribute to Crete are over forever. He comes back out, winding up the string, and he takes Ariadne with him, because she's, because she betrayed the kingdom. She's as good as dead, and so he takes her with him, and they sail for Greece, and along the way they stop on an island, and he abandons her. He's not a sweet, Theseus mythologically is not a sweet guy. He abandons her and leaves her there, and makes off for Athens. She, meanwhile, is Bacchus. Liber Bacchus falls in love with her, and he marries her, and she is from then on called Libera. And she is where our constellation, she was the ministress of justice, and she is where our constellation of Libera in the heavens comes from now. But they were so priding themselves in the fact that they had tricked the Minotaur and had come home successful that they forgot to change the flags. And they had a signal that if they arrived with a black flag, it meant that the mission was unsuccessful, and that if they had a white flag when they came back to Athens, it meant that they were successful, so that his father wouldn't have to be worried about the sun. So what happens is they forget to change flags, and they're flying under the black flag, and the messengers see the flag, and they go tell Aegeus that they're arriving under the black flag, and he dies in grief. So Theseus at this point comes home, and he is now king, but he comes home in great grief. The part that we're interested in is that he liked to go on adventures. And he went with Heracles on a campaign against the Amazon women. And in that battle, or in that war, he overcomes a woman called Antiope, who was a queen of one of the Amazon tribes. There was another queen called Hippolyta, who was also a queen of the Amazons, and she was defeated by Heracles. And she had a famous girdle that was modeled after the girdle of Venus, which, when it was worn, she was hidden within a cloud of charm. Heracles won that from her. But what Theseus won was Antiope. So this is the first case we run into that we find something grossly inaccurate in Shakespeare. Theseus was never married to Hippolyta at all. He was married to Antiope. And no mythology that I know of says anything different. But she did have a son who is called Hippolytus. She bore a son to Theseus who was called Hippolytus, and that's what we're going to talk about for a little bit. And she did have a sister that has one of those impronounceable names that was sometimes called Hippolyta, and that's where the source of confusion may have come in. So at any rate, Theseus has a daughter by Antiope, and he's called Hippolytus. But Antiope becomes insanely jealous. And when Theseus is going to marry Phaedra, who is his legitimate wife, and she happens to be the sister of Ariadne of all things, it gets very complex and involved. And when she's going to marry her as part of a political marriage, she wants to kill Phaedra, and so what happens is that Theseus has to kill her because she's just violent and uncontrollable. Now I want to take one of those tangential side trips. No, that was the background to Theseus and his marriage to the Amazon, which is misrepresented in Midsummer Night's Dream. What? Yes. All right. It's quite a bit of a side trip, but I've always liked going into studies of triune consciousness. That's why I'd like to go and see the famous Trimurti in the bay at Bombay. In Bombay, they have a famous statue. It's a huge, big head that has all three faces of the Trinity, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiv, on the different sides of the statue. When Theseus married Phaedra, whose name means bright one, he sent Hippolytus to Troezen because he didn't want him around. He was a bastard son, or at least the Greeks thought he was a bastard son. And in Troezen, he was accepted as an heir to the throne. Hippolytus, the young man, was very devoted to Artemis, and he remained chaste all of his life. And when he got to Troezen, he built a temple to her. And this made the goddess Aphrodite jealous of Artemis, because normally that was her territory. So Aphrodite, in her jealousy, went to Phaedra, the new wife of Theseus, and when Hippolytus happened to be in town to celebrate the Eleusinian mysteries, she had Phaedra look on Hippolytus and fall in love with him. When Theseus was out of town on his adventures, she went down to Troezen, and there she built the temple of the peeping Aphrodite. The things that they come up with are just fantastic in their imagination. And this was a temple to Aphrodite in which she had peepholes. And what she would do is she would look out these peepholes at Hippolytus as he did all of his exercises, which he did completely nude. So she was something of a voyeur. And as he worked on his fitness program, she was watching him all the time. She kept her love for him very secret, but she languished away. And like frustrated people, what she did is she took the leaves of a tree and she'd stick pins in them and tear them apart. And then they had those pins. The myrtle tree to this day has the pins sticking out of the end because everything around them has been ripped away by other pins going in and tearing the leaves apart. That's something of a allegory for the myths, for the mysteries, but we won't go into that. And one day, her old nurse guesses that she must be in love with Hippolytus, and she tells her, "Why don't you write him a letter?" And he happens to be staying in the palace again, I think for the Eleusinian Mysteries or something like that. And she writes this huge, big, long letter proclaiming in flaming terms her love for him. And she tells him that she has converted from the religion of Aphrodite to the religion of Artemis for his sake. And she went all the way to Crete to have special sacred wooden images to Artemis brought to her. And she invites him and she says, "Why don't we go hunting together?" And then the letter takes a different turn, and she starts to bewail the fate of the women of her family, including Ariadne, who was jilted by Theseus. When the door is open to ragging on Theseus, what she does is she said, "You know, he killed your mother, and he jilted my sister, and he'll probably eventually kill me too." She says they could please both Aphrodite and Artemis if they went out hunting and fell in the weeds somewhere. Hippolytus gets the letter, and being a virgin votary of Artemis, he's just, he can't believe it. He's horrified by it. And the first thing he does is burns it. Big mistake. He then goes to Phaedra's chamber, and he loudly starts reproaching her, shouting at her and telling her how bad she is and everything else. And she's very cunning. She starts tearing all of her clothes off and rips them all off in pieces, and she starts screaming, "I'm being raped, I'm being raped." And he panics and runs. And he goes off with his team of 4 horses and a chariot. He takes off at full speed for Troezen. And she, meanwhile, hangs herself to death from the doorpost and leaves a message saying that she has been raped by Hippolytus. Theseus comes upon all of this, and he's just enraged, and he has one wish left from his father Poseidon, and what he does is he wishes that his son will die on that very day. And what happens is Hippolytus is racing, and when he gets to the narrowest point of the isthmus on the way to Troezen, what happens is a huge wave comes up, like a tidal wave, and it comes up over the Malurian Peak, which is the high point in the Narrows, and it frightens the horses. And the horses run away, but he hangs on with all of his might, and he keeps them from going off the cliff. But in the process, they dash him against the rocks, and the reins get caught in an olive tree that is sacred to Artemis, and he's just dashed into the rocks, and he's killed almost immediately. Now there are all kinds of variants at this point, and some say that Artemis reveals the truth to his father Theseus and then puts him in a mist and teleports him to where his son is dying and they're reconciled at his son's death. Some say that Diomedes, the god of horses, dedicates a temple, probably a mystery temple for a horse cult, on the very spot where he died, and that both Hippolytus and Phaedra are buried there. And right at the edge of the temple is where one of those myrtle trees with the pinpoint leaves grows out. The Troezans say he doesn't die, but that Zeus takes him up into heaven as the charioteer, which pretty soon we'll be able to see in the summer sky, in fact even late spring. And the Athenians, in honor to him, raised a great barrel of earth, I think for gymnastic purposes because he was such a gymnast. When Hippolytus' soul is taken to Tartarus, Artemis pleads with the famous healer and mystagogue Aesculapius to use herbs to resurrect him, which he does. But the three fates and Hades are so outraged at this breach of protocol or this breach of privilege that they persuade Zeus to kill him with a bolt of lightning immediately. And so he is twice born and twice died. The Latins had yet a different interpretation to it. They said that when the chariot crashed, he was wrapped in a mist by Artemis, and that his features were changed, and she first thought of taking him to Crete and then to Delos, but eventually took him to a place in the Italian peninsula and placed him in a sacred oak grove and married him to a wood nymph there and changed his name to Virbius, which means twice a man. Now, this is just packed with all kinds of initiate consciousness that we won't even touch on a tenth of it. Stories like this prepare us for anything. When we listen to the weavings of story upon story, each more fantastic than the other, it opens our imagination and it opens our consciousness to all kinds of different things, so that we're then ready or in the right mood to talk about mysticism and some of the lore of it. Several years ago, we talked about myths of triangles, because in talking about triangles, we were trying to waken up to our selfhood, which is a divine conception of the spiritual masculine will and the spiritual feminine imagination, and that our selfhood, our being, is an idea, a divinely conceived idea. You know how it is when you wake up to something begins to dawn on you, and sometimes it can last for months. The idea that has dawned on you, more and more and more becomes awake. Well, our whole selfhood is like that. It's a divine, eternal idea that is continuously becoming. That's one attribute of it. And that relationship of the will, the imagination, and the conceiving conceiver, that triune consciousness, is what we tried to talk about several years ago in Myths on Triangles. But we only got to look at two myths and two different types of triangular relationships. And now that I'm in that age where all of my triangles have to be spiritual love triangles. I want to carry those out. When we looked at Oedipus, we saw that Oedipus married his mother after killing his father. He didn't know it was his father. And we said at that time that this represented the coalescence of selfhood with the selfness of the divine feminine, or the coalescence of the truth knower, the Holy Ghost, or the self, is called the Spirit of Truth, how that is born out of pure truth, which is what the second, the luminous one, represents. And that this was done without recognition of the divine will, but only seeing the divine will to be through the life and the light and the truth of the second. Then we went on to a second triangle, which was the triangle of Isis, Osiris, Horus, and Seth. We saw that Osiris, which represented the father, was killed by his brother. That is, the attention was taken away from the divine will of the spiritual creator and refocused into the manifest, material, resistant earth. Sort of that will is developed through resistance. And that Isis, while she didn't marry Seth, she resurrected the parts of Osiris, but gave her attentions to Seth. And that Horus was the avenger, that he represented the self, and that he continuously overcame in battle after battle after battle. He always defeated Seth, and each time he defeated Seth, Osiris would reawaken him, and Horus would do it over again and again and again. So that in the triangle of Isis, Osiris, and Horus, Horus is then the avenging spirit, and avenges by overcoming matter and drawing the soul essence out of it back into the spirit, whereas the rejuvenating mother, the second attribute of Trinity, always brought things back to life. We're going to look at that myth in great detail next fall, because that's exactly the structure of the relationship between Hamlet and his mother, his uncle, and his father. It's the exact story, and we're going to look some into that. So here we have a visible manifestation of the Father in the Son that perpetually vindicates the Father in overcoming matter again and again and again, only to have it resurrected again. In this story, we have a different case. In this case, we have a stepmother, but a mother nonetheless, falling in love with her son. She's not a physical mother, but she's something like a mother. And she yearns to coalesce with him. But the son abruptly refuses, and the son then comes into death, or at least he's struck by lightning and has a few other things happen. And he's again resurrected. In the Gospels, Christ, who is a living representative of that second or feminine principle, says to his disciples, I must leave, or else I can't come back for you. And you can't follow me unless I leave. He says, I'm going to prepare a place for you, and in his stead he leaves the Comforter, which is the human spirit or the Holy Spirit. What appears to be being said in this myth is that the separative, the only individuated of the threefold spirit, the third member of the spirit, realizes it cannot come into its own being if it unites itself with the life spirit, because the life spirit is formless. And if it gives itself to that formless, ever-rejuvenescent life, to that state, it will not be able to maintain the integrity of its own being. That's the state of consciousness that is represented by Hippolytus in this mythical story. There is indeed a recognition that there has to be the development of a selfhood and of a character that is of service. Yeah. In every sense of the word, we are the eyes. Not only these eyes, but the I amnesses. We are the eyes of the Spirit. And it is our duty, it is our purpose to indeed be that. Because it is through individuation, it is through selfhood that the pure spirit, in its different attributive states of consciousness, knows itself in an objectified way. In the reflection on the idea of a self, the subsistent beingness of the divine recognizes itself objectified as a being. So that self and God are both ideas. And they are both born in the same way. And in the early stages of this birth, in the becoming of this idea, it is important that the more disintegrating or deformalizing nature of the pure spirit, especially the second attribute, not be too present, because that would tend to dissolve the selfhood. And so this is what we're talking about as our divine service, and this is what is involved in the myth of Hippolytus. We can't give ourself to God unless we have a self to give. There is a great danger of individuating too far, and if we do separatively individuate, that could be detrimental. There is that potentiality of that great loss, but it doesn't have to be. Usually, there is a problem of not having sufficient selfhood in order to have something to show, in order to have something to offer. The activities were at a much different state of development than what is indicated in the myth of Hippolytus, because as it goes now, we can develop selfhood coetaneously with the development of the recognition of selfness. This is what is meant, like in Christian statements, I am in you and you are in me. That as we develop, we recognize that our selfhood has the selfness of the feminine life spirit, that total consciousness that coalesces and holds all things together, and that simultaneously that we're developing ourselves and becoming creative foci, that we can do that with the awareness of the creative love and the creative imagination through which these things are accomplished. It is important that Hippolytus is chaste. The third attribute, the human spirit, called in Christianity the Holy Ghost, is in charge of the procreative function. And that generative energy of that function is meant to be kept secret. And this is how through that life force, which some would call Kundalini, is how the union is consummated. He has a self-respect, a healthy self-respect for not entering into an illicit union. So his consciousness, this is again a tragedy. He is rewarded by an initiation, and the initiation happens to look terrible. He isn't stabbed to death like Julius Caesar or hung like the hung men, but he is dragged to death by 4 horses, as was the case in the horse cults. He's being drawn or pulled up by a higher power. This is something we're going to talk about quite a bit because we're going to go into the mysteries of Demeter, which had a lot to do with horses. He dies by a word from Poseidon. And Poseidon is Neptune, which represents the human spirit. But he also dies by the thunderbolt of Zeus. And Zeus, Jupiter, represents the ideational mind. And at a baptism of the Holy Spirit, there is the thunderbolt of light that enters appears to enter the cranium, and one has like a thunderbolt of light just hanging out there. And so the ideational mind is another way of looking at the human spirit. And the sun is yet the third way. All of these are shown on the trident of Neptune, the symbol of Jupiter, and the sun are all shown on the third attribute on the throne of Shiv in India. The 4 horses also represent the 4 winds of destiny, the law that it comes about through the Holy Spirit. So it is by the law or fulfilling the law that he comes to this end. I just mentioned 1 or 2 little things, and we'll get on to, to what we're supposed to be doing tonight. Aesculapius, who resurrects him, is a Babylonian word. In Babylonian, it means son of the serpent, going back to the age of Taurus when the serpent cults were the initiate hierophants. And in Greek, it means hung from an oak tree. So we again have that hanged man initiate theme. So Hippolytus is a twice born. There's a whole lot more that we could go into, especially the tree lore. And I think I'm going to have to live perpetually for the next 500 years because I feel like I'm just rushing and trying to say all these things because there just isn't enough time. At any rate, after the interlude with the death of Hippolytus, Theseus continues to have adventures with his friend Peirithous. They go to Sparta and they capture Helen, who is later on to be Helen of Troy. But she's just a little girl. And they raise a whole army and they defeat the Spartans, and they bring Helen back home, and they cast lots for who's going to get Helen. And Theseus wins, but his friend says, but then you have to get me a bride, the bride of my choosing. So when Helen grows up, so that she's of first marriageable age, Theseus wants to marry her, and he can't do so because he owes a bride to his friend. And so they decide to settle it by going to the oracle at Delphi saying, who should we get? And of all things, the Delphi, they go to the oracle of Zeus, not to the oracle of Apollo. They go to the oracle of Zeus. And the oracle comes back and says, you should get Persephone, the daughter of Zeus, the daughter of Demeter, and the bride of Hades, the king of the underworld. Theseus is outraged, saying, why should I get this woman as a bride for my friend? But his friend says, a deal is a deal, and this is the woman that I want. And so he has to go down into the underworld. And he avoids going across the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and instead he goes down one of the caves. When he gets down there, the two of them are there together, and they start talking to Hades, and they tell him what he wants. And Hades acts like he's really friendly. He feigns them hospitality, and he says, he's not. These are outrageous things. They're saying, please give us your wife. I want him for my friend here. And this is the God of all the dead. And he says, well, why don't you just take a seat? And they've got this settee there, and they sit down, and it is the seat of forgetfulness. And immediately, as soon as they sit into it, their consciousness becomes woozy and weary, and they cling to the seat. They grow right into the seat, and they're afraid to pull themselves out of it because they're afraid they're going to mutilate themselves because they're stuck to it. The serpents are hissing around them, and the Furies are lashing at them, and the big dog Kerberos comes and chews on them for a while. And they're like this for 4 years in the underworld, and then Heracles, who is on his quest of the 12 labors, comes down to get the dog, Kerberos, and he sees him sitting there. And so he grabs him by the arm, and he pulls him out of the seat, and they get pulled out, except that a little bit of the fanny is left behind. And this is why in all the history of the Greeks ever after, while all of the Greek men had small butts. It's very, very funny. While they're gone, Castor and Polydeuces, the Discori, the brothers of Helen, they get an army, and they come and they take their sister back. And so when he gets back home, he doesn't have his child bride, but so his friend doesn't either. He takes off on one more adventure, and he goes up to the Scythia. He's trying to found a new colony on an island there. And while he's on the top of a cliff, his guest, who is again feigning pleasantries, pushes him over the cliff, and that's the end of Theseus. So, in all of this, obviously, Helen and Persephone represent the alchemical bride in microcosm and macrocosm, which they did all the way down to Goethe's Faust. And all of this is a thinly veiled allegory about the Eleusinian mysteries, about which we're going to talk extensively. All heroes, that is, initiates, had to die the little death. They had to leave their bodies. They had to pass into the world of the dead, into the underworld, and then come back. And when they did so, they were all twice born, and they were all divine beings. The obvious main moral in this story, and the only reason I told the story at all, is as a reminder to myself, because I get lazy. And if you're on the spiritual path, you dare never, ever rest in contentment. if you become complacent or contented or self-satisfied or anything like that, your spiritual life dies. It's just like the rarest things rot the quickest, the most lively lives go into decadence the quickest. So we've seen about Theseus that he had a pretty full and adventurous life. He was a bit morally checkered, but he did have a lot of experience, and that is why we're here. In our play, he is not quite so adventurous. And beside having a bride that he never had, there's something else that's false about him. In this play, Theseus is almost just a figurehead. The play opens where he's anticipating his wedding to Hippolyta. He says, "Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws apace. 4 happy days bring in another moon, but oh, methinks how slow this moon wanes. She lingers my desires like to a stepdame or a dowager, long withering out a young man's revenue." Hippolyta puts him at ease. Betsy's going to read Hippolyta's next few lines there. Yeah.
4 days will quickly steep itself in night. 4 days will quickly dream away the time. And then the moon, like a silver bowl, blue bent in heaven, shall behold the night of our silence.
All right. The mythology of Shakespeare in this case may be incorrect, but his knowledge of mystery lore is not incorrect. We've been talking about there being a spiritual king for the winter months and a material king for the summer months. And each engenders his own successor. That kings that were to be newborn material kings were always conceived at the first new moon after the summer solstice, which means they were born right after the equinox, the spring equinox. And so they were born under the sun when it's in its exaltation and rising up into material supremacy. In a similar way, the kings that were to be divine kings were always conceived at the first new moon after midwinter. And they were then born at autumnal equinox, and they were born into the inner underworld at the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, the passing into the material world. In our play, this is again Aegeus. This is another confusion by Shakespeare. Aegeus was actually the father of Theseus. This is maybe another Aegeus. He enters and he wants an audience with Theseus. And he's accompanied with his daughter Hermia and 2 young gentlemen named Demetrius and Lysander. And when he's given leave to speak, he says that Demetrius has leave to marry his daughter Hermia. But he goes on to say that she refuses, saying that she's in love with Lysander, and that Lysander has bewitched her by serenading her and giving her little presents and all of those sorts of bewitching kinds of things. Theseus tries to reason with her by pointing out that she should revere her father or revere her father as though he were a god, and goes on to point out that Demetrius is a fine gentleman. And he tries to convince her, but she's just as eloquent in her responses. And the more he tries to convince her that she should do this, the more she digs in her heels. And finally she asks, what happens if I don't marry him? And he says, either die the death or to abjure forever the society of men. Therefore, fair Hermia, question your desires. Know of your youth, examine well your blood, whether if ye yield not to your father's choice, you can endure the livery of a nun. For I, to be in shady cloister, mewed, to live a barren sister all of your life, chanting faint hymns to the cold, fruitless moon, thrice blessed they that master so their blood, to undergo such maiden pilgrimage. But earthlier happy is the rose distilled than that which withering on the virgin thorn grows, lives, and dies in single blessedness. He says, same thing. Either you die or you become a nun. It almost seems like Theseus is sitting in the chair, like he's having some kind of paralysis of mind. He's locked in the law. Lawgivers always get locked in the law. It's the way it seems slaves are more free than kings are. You know, when you're part of the system, you identify with it. He's not at all free. When you represent the state, or when you represent a religion, or if you take any kind of representative point, what is happening is you identify yourself with the position that you're representing. And any kind of identification saps the individuality of its spiritual strength, because the spiritual strength has been given to something outside of it. And this is what's happened to Theseus. He's part of the, he's part of the system. It almost never fails. We see it with our politicians all the time. They aren't completely phony. By the time they get to significant positions, they become so very soon thereafter. You know, you ever hear politicians talk about anything like they're completely out of touch with reality? You know, it's like they miss common sense things. They miss any kind of real analysis. So the process of identification you don't have to lose your selfhood to another being or to a fractionated part of your own character. You can lose it to almost anything, a totem object, or even a social, political, or religious institution. It doesn't work with somebody who's fresh and somebody who's in love. So that down around lines 79 to 82, who wants to be Hermia? One of the three ladies or four ladies wants to be Hermia. Let's see, it's line 79. So will I grow. Anybody want to read it? You want to read it? No, you're nominated.
So will I grow, so live, so die, my Lord. There I will yield my virgin path upon his lordship, whose unwished yoke my soul consents not to give so much.
Ann Landers is right. You know what I mean? She said, if your kid brings home somebody you don't like, don't try to stop it, because all they'll do is dig in all the more. It's really so, and I think Shakespeare was pretty cognizant of it. But Theseus is not completely sold out, because even though she digs in, he says, well, I'll give you 3 days until the new moon to make your decision. He's wise enough to know that time can cause people to have a change of heart, especially if there's a change of moon at the same time. Astrologically, I do things like that all the time. Tell people to wait for 3 days or 3 weeks or something like that. And if they're in that period of time, they can see things better and make a decision. Demetrius makes his case, states his side of things, but every time he does, Lysander always has a perfect rejoinder. It's a beautiful one. Lysander tells Demetrius, "You have her father's love, Demetrius. Let me have Hermias. Do you marry him?" Instead. It's the kind of thing that everybody would like to say at least once in their life. Lysander, of course, pleads that he's every bit as noble and gentle and worthy as Demetrius. Plus, he has the love of Hermia, and therefore he should marry her. And then he brings in a really devastating point. He points out, he says, Demetrius has already wooed Helena, another lady of the court. And Theseus says, yeah, that's all true, and I intended to speak to him about that. But he says, I gotta go now. He's on the spot, and everybody leaves. And just the two lovers are alone. And at this point, what are we here? Lysander says, "Oh, if there were a sympathy in choice, war, death, or sickness did lay siege to it, making it momentary, as any sound, swift as a shadow, short as any dream, brief as the lightning in the cold night, that in a spleen unfolds both heaven and earth, and ere a man hath power to say, behold, the jaws of night do devour it up. So quick bright things come to confusion." Lysander then says, I've got an aunt who is a widow dowager, and she's got a little cabin that is just outside of the jurisdiction of Athens, and he says, let's elope to there. He says, tomorrow night, I'll meet you at a spot in the woods where I met you and Helena one time last summer, or something like that. And she promises to do that most eloquently, along around 168.
My good Lysander, I swear to thee by Cupid's strongest bow, by his best arrow with a golden head, by the simplicity of being by that which knitteth souls and prospers loves, and by the fire which burned the Carthage queen when the false coach by her sail was seen, by all the vows that ever man had broke, in number more than ever was spoke. In that same place thou hast appointed me tomorrow, truly behind me.
Pretty, isn't it? Very pretty. So, having made her a promise, Helena comes in, and in her exchange with Hermia, she says her say about the affair. You want to be Helena, Tinny? We're on 181 there. Call you me fair?
Call you me fair, that fair again unseen. Demetrius loves you fair, O happy fair. Your eyes are moon stars, and your tongue sweet air going to bloom, and love to ship its gear. With leaf is green, with hope and buds appear, sickness is catching. Oh, with favored so. Yours will I catch, sweeter, the fair Hermia, ere I go. My ear should catch your voice, my eye your eye. My tongue should catch your tongue's sweet melody. With a little pine, Demetrius being baby. The rest I give to be to you fastly. So teach me how you look, and with what art you sway the motion of Demetrius' heart.
I don't think I can even write Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star kinds of poetry compared. Somewhere along the line then, Hermia spills the beans about their planned elopement together, and they spell it out poetically, which Betsy will read around 203 there.
Lysander and myself will fly this night before the time I did Lysander see, seemed Athens as paradise to me. O then, with
and they leave. And when Helena is alone, she reviews her situation, but apparently her emotions have addled her mind, because instead of letting the elopement go off smoothly, which would be to her benefit, because if it went off smoothly, Lysander and Hermia would be out of the picture, and then she would have Demetrius to herself. But she wants to curry favor. And she says, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell Demetrius, and when Demetrius knows, he will love me for having been faithful, and he will see that I'm the one he should have married all along, and things will go well. And that's the end of the first scene. Now, it's too bad that we don't have information about the people in the play more well developed, because there are some topics I'd like to go into, and one of them is astrological. For example, when people are born into male bodies, when we take a masculine rebirth, we are then more subject to Mars and the Sun. And being so, the whole structure of the body and part of the unconscious psyche, the more nature part of our body that goes with it, is also under the influence of Mars and the Sun. So the masculine personality over all men tends to be slightly more bold, more active, more assertive, more aggressive. The relation of the attention to an object of the attention when one is functioning in a male's body is much more goal-oriented. It is more like hunting, more like stalking. It may not always be on a crude level of expression, but in the male's body, one goes out and accomplishes things. In a female incarnation, one has to protect and take care and rear children. I spent one time the entire winter. I was going to marry this woman, and she had 2 children, and I spent the entire winter in the household. And I recognized a lot of things I never knew before. In the first place, a woman puts herself in a really vulnerable place to have children. She can't go out in the world anymore, and she's in this life where she's vulnerable. But rather than being a lineal solar martial life that goes after an object like an arrow, she's in these cycles where everything gets done, but nothing gets done. You know what I mean? It's the same routine day after day after day, and it's like the character of a child grows up. As it grows up, it incubates in an egg of daily rhythms and habits and cycles and things like that that repeat themselves over again and again. And for a man who has to go out and accomplish things, at least that's the tendency of the Mars and the Sun versus Venus and the Moon, which are more active in the physical body when we take a feminine incarnation, that's really hard to deal with. It is especially the case in men who are more primitive and who are less self-conscious and are less capable of controlling their stars. It is especially pronounced in people who play the man. That is, who get into this very masculine role things. In short, then in the relationship between men and women, if things are left to natural consciousness, what happens is that the man moves moves into conquest mode. Not everything is bad about this psychology. Some of it is very good, and there are very good lessons to be learned. Carlos Castaneda makes excellent points about stalkers and gazers. And it's interesting to note that in his writings, the most excellent stalkers are usually males, and the most excellent gazers are usually females. It's not an overwhelming gender distinction, and if one tries to make it so, it's a really very materialistic outlook. But how to deal with it? It seems that one cannot take on a phony unisex androgyny. I think it is much more healthy to live out the experience wholly, not giving oneself to it in abandon, but like really living it out. Our incarnations are very much like roles in a play, and that each role has a valuable part to offer. And unless each of us lives our role very well, nobody else can live out their role very well, and then life becomes a trifling, a shallow thing, and we don't get much out of the experience. But we dare not get stuck in a role. We have to pass through it. And when we pass through it, then we take. If we are impermeable, if we remain men and let women remain women and don't have part of their character take in each other, we're never going to progress. It's good that we're playing a role, but if we're stuck in that role and don't let the opposite role sink in, we're not going to develop either. Somehow, when we are secure in our role, we can allow the experience of the other to enter into us. And when that takes place, we can grow up and we can be total humans and not just gender distinct or like thin, shallow androgynes. The material world, as it is, where we have only the outer consciousness and not a balanced inner-outer consciousness, means specialization. And specialization is important. Our consciousness is very, very infantile, and we can only learn objective lessons in very specialized little portions. And when we learn them, then we can grow up to a more generalized consciousness and be able to be somebody like a Leonardo that is master of many, many different things simultaneously. So until then, it appears that the wise thing is not to go for the conquest or not to go for the attractive gazing and voyeurism, but the thing is to really live out our roles and benefit each other and become like what we love. When we really love something, we want to be like it. And so in middle life, we have that crossover where men indeed become more sweet. In fact, a lot of old men are just like little old women. And women, as the internal vital body, as the etheric vehicle gets stronger and it's gendered oppositely, women become strong and assertive. And that is just the way it is supposed to be. That it is, that we have to constantly have a change. We have to change in ourselves and in a differential with our partner. As a character grows in a play, each other character has to adjust accordingly. And similarly, I think in our male-female roles, where we compensate each other or complement each other, that in those roles that we also have to have that all-important mutual differential of change so that we grow together and that we grow in ourselves at a rate that the other can go with us. So we'll maybe come back to this at another time in a deeper sense, but it's one little thing that I wanted to go into for a long time. We'll call it an evening at that, and next time we'll start out with scene 2 and stick exclusively with Shakespeare and not tons of mythology instead. Thank you very much.